Thank you all for being here. I wanted to do today, so my work focuses on macro and political risk for across a number of sectors, including the mining industry, but also oil and gas, energy more generally. And so I wanted to talk about some of those trends as I see them into 2025 and beyond. And the like. And I do that work both at Ziemba Insights, as mentioned, but also with a firm called Horizon Engage that is a political risk consultancy. It spends a lot of time thinking about the key players in these industries and the regulations that are changing. And for them, I do work on all the restrictive economic statecraft tools like sanctions that are relevant in some of the risky markets that we were just talking about before here, but also this sort of use of government balance sheets in the US and Canada, Australia, Europe, Japan in the mining sector. So it's that whole barbell approach in a sense. So anyway, enough about me. I'll talk for, sort of a set of time, but if you have a burning question, please raise your hand. We're a small group. I think we can take some of those and then leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So I'm going to focus on critical minerals, which, as we heard earlier, actually now encompasses a much wider set of minerals. Not always the same set. Even within the U.S. government, they don't always agree on what is encompassed there. But these are which I think can be then bucketed into the minerals that are linked to batteries, that are linked to energy transition, that are linked to military supply chains. That doesn't cover all of them, but it covers. But I think from a policy perspective and supply chain dynamics, that becomes very important. So the good news here is that government support, government interest has put focus on some of the bottlenecks in mining and the like. The bad news and challenging news is that there's more competition and that there are more macro policy risks that are challenging. We heard about that on the panel earlier, this question mark of what are the strings that come, but also this challenge of playing catch up. And so for some of these mining endeavors, there is more of an element of catch up with the Chinese technology. For others, we'll be talking tomorrow, I'm sure, about even more about gold and precious metals. This is an area where things are much more developed. So I want to talk about three big themes. I'll focus most of my remarks on the U.S. and policy shifts in the U.S. and the West, but there are a few other key elements, I think, that are important to shape the next few years of global markets. The key trends that I see are a bit of good news, bad news from the U.S. and the West, as the political and financial support is up across the partisan spectrum. And we can talk more about how that plays out. Permitting reform is on the table in a way that it has not been for many years, and that's partly a function that permitting is needed for renewable energy projects, for grid, for mining projects, for oil and gas projects. So I'm not putting a timeline on when permitting reform gets passed and exactly what's in and what's out, but the fact that both major parties are talking about permitting reform just is the kind of dynamic that a few months ago, definitely a few years ago, might have seemed like more of a stretch. The challenge, as I mentioned earlier, that some of the Western players are rushing to catch up. There are still financing challenges, and mining projects can both coincide with but also conflict with other industrial policy priorities. So there can be opportunities there, including co-location and support of the auto sector, but it also creates political challenges that sometimes there is more desire and focus to support, say, last mile projects, such as the battery factories, and not the processing and the mining that is necessary to build out that whole supply chain. Now, consolidation and prioritization might help with that, but that's still a challenge that is present. Before I go back into some of the details in the US and what a Harris administration or a Trump administration look like, I want to talk about two other themes. One is this desire from especially emerging market producers and sources of metals to move up the value chain, to look for technology transfer, to develop processing and user factories. This is, to some extent, something economists have been suggesting they do for years and decades, right? We tend to get concerned, economists like me, when countries just produce raw materials. We say move up secondary, tertiary, develop service sectors, but in practice, sometimes that's hard to do, especially in cases where some of the areas that are rich in the resources can be far-flung, and you may not have the labor. But I think it is relevant that countries, whether we're talking about Indonesia or Chile or Namibia, many countries are now looking for that technology transfer. We're also even seeing that as some of the dynamics in question that funds, sort of sovereign funds from the Middle East are involved in. They're looking for technology transfer and labor at home. So this is something, it depends country by country, but it's something that's very important for thinking about investments. The issue, of course, is not only labor and added value, but also environmental rules and the like. These dynamics can make projects more difficult, but it also can create opportunities. The other challenge, of course, is that in some cases for Western projects and big companies, that it may be the Chinese companies that are more able to step in and provide some of those dynamics. Other big, we've talked a lot, and we can't talk about the role of China in these supply chains. I think what's important is not only this sort of market dominance and early mover advantage and sort of dynamics of price, but also the changes going on in China's own economy that mean that this sort of construction-related boom for key metals is no longer there to the same extent. There's been a lot of talk sort of on Wall Street about the stimulus or lack thereof that's been present in the Chinese economy. A lot of people, myself included, see it as more an asset stimulating trend, especially equity markets. The Chinese government is pumping more liquidity in the system, but we're not really seeing a feed through to more investment. Credit demand is still quite weak. Probably at best it is helping put a floor and avoid further deterioration on some of the construction projects, but it's hard to see a dynamic where the extra projects are absorbed. But we can talk more about that. I'm interested to hear thoughts from the audience if they're seeing other trends. The other challenge is one, having added a lot of capacity both in conventional vehicles and electric vehicles in China and around the world, that more vehicles are being produced now than are being consumed and are being kept with. Now, for some time, it's been lucky for China that Russia has been a major source of demand, particularly for conventional vehicles, but that too seems to be slowing down. The reason I bring this up is it just sort of highlights some of the short-term market challenges, both to the raw materials used, but also to the finished goods. It's also a dynamic where, on the one hand, there's been this additional supply coming on the market, and I'm saying both finished goods, but also batteries, at a time when a lot of new battery plants have been green-lit. There's a question how many of those will come to fruition. Some of this is a short-term challenge and perhaps a longer-term opportunity, but there's a time inconsistency challenge that probably goes beyond the 5-year period that some of the incentives from the US and partner governments are doing. So, cautious optimism, some good stories there. The other challenge in this space is the fact that China, with its market share in key commodities such as graphite, such as rare earths, germanium, gallium, as well as lithium, is starting to mirror the export control policies of the United States. Now, if you talk to Chinese officials, they say, oh, of course, we're not bringing in export licensing just because the U.S. is restricting our access to high-level chips. But the timing seems a bit suspicious. Now, if anything, these dynamics, these outright bans on export of the technology used to make rare earth magnets and other processing equipment, that they create a dynamic where it almost increases the urgency to build more redundancy in the supply chain, to create new sources, but also send a message, perhaps unsurprisingly, that China and Chinese companies are not going to make it easy to develop some of this equipment. At current structure, the items in this space the restrictions have been greatest on the processing, the battery creation side, and less so on the finished products. That makes some sense, right, from a market perspective. Why cut off supplies to a market that you can get funds from? But the creation of a licensing agreement, the requirement of regulations, just adds an additional step of paperwork that has to go through. It is probably good for lawyers and other people who have to file those. I'm not against job creation for lawyers, even though I'm not one. But I think that question mark, it raises the risk that there can be that these could be used as a diplomatic tool. So something to watch. It adds to the interest of security-focused entities of developing these supply chains, but that doesn't mean it's easy to do in practice. So, with the, sort of the next sort of remaining part of the talk, I want to talk a little bit about the policy dynamics in the U.S., what could change, what might not change in the next administration. The panel, I think, did a nice job earlier, for those of you who are here, sort of highlighting that there is a bipartisan consensus in support of mining, in support of critical minerals. I think some of it, the branding and framing of calling things critical always helps, just like calling something national security, that helps. That right now, there are at least 15 pieces of legislation in front of the House and Senate that in some way or the other are supportive of mining and critical minerals. Now, some of them, as always, they contradict. Some of them are just statements that, maybe aren't worth much more than the paper they're written on. But I do think that this is something that there is a recognition of the importance of these supply chains. There's also a recognition of the importance of permitting reform and speeding up mining approvals and dealing with this gap on the processing side. I will note, of course, that U.S. government funding, whether it's from the Department of Defense and the like, and the pledges, has still been relatively smaller towards mining than it has been towards other parts of the supply chain, particularly on the battery assembly side. For some of the U.S. allies, like Canada, that disconnect has probably been even greater. But I think that in the Canadian context, it has a lot to do with in any country, I think it has to do with the political dynamics of keeping auto sector jobs. And it's a little more difficult to allocate the funds to build roads, to do a variety of things. So on this so if we dive deeper, where are the areas of this bipartisan agreement? There's a focus on greater coordination of government efforts. Right now, there's over 22 government agencies and subdepartments that have some role in approving some projects. This is, sometimes they work hand in hand, but often they do not. There's a couple of consolidation efforts going on to have a key point place in the federal government to try to smooth things through. Now, of course, that's something that can help a lot if it's federal land or in dealing with troops. And that doesn't not all land, of course, is federal land. There's a commitment to securing supply chains. There's also a commitment to trying to increase local U.S. production over foreign. Now that I think is probably going to be something that's, there's a bit of a challenge coming in the next administration as U.S. companies try to argue for maybe a little less nearshoring and a little more support at home. That's going to be something to watch with the big, not only energy players moving into the mining space, but also some of the big producers. Now, it's going to depend metal by metal because the U.S. does not have all supply chains, nor would it be possible to create it. But that tension of how much is reshoring versus how much is nearshoring is, I think, going to come to play. Domestic energy production, including, I would say, the battery space and the metals used to build out the grid, is going to be a priority no matter who sits in the White House. That's because of energy security risks, affordability risks. If you look at the rhetoric from the Harris campaign, this is the closest to sort of full-throated support of U.S. energy abundance that I've seen, and as long as I can in the last several decades. Now, of course, the priorities differ, and there will be, if it's a Harris administration, there will be more questions on environmental regulations, labor, the role of indigenous populations will probably be more prominent. But as those who are operating in areas where indigenous communities are present can already point to, having good relations and having stakeholders and partners in the indigenous community can actually help those projects go ahead. And maybe that's something that U.S. producers can learn from the challenges and occasionally headaches of Australian and especially Canadian providers. Other things that are common: use of U.S. export controls on technology and tariffs. That creates both opportunities for local production, but also potential retaliation. The other thing that may be important, especially for certain investors, is this increase in financialization of traded metals, this push towards stockpiles, thinking about, could we have a strategic reserve for metals, not just petroleum. This is an idea that's been percolating around for a few years now, has gotten more traction of late. Some of it is even just making sure that there are pathways on the mercantile exchange to trade certain blends of lithium. Now, you can't just create them and expect they're going to be liquid or expect that's going to help with hedging. And that's where I think having those tools might create a space for government to be able to set some sort of a minimum price, because some of the problem we're talking about here is the long life cycle of mining projects and the shorter term cycle of both politicians, but also the prices today that might lead financial support to be more lacking. Now, I've talked about the commonalities and more than hinted at the differences, but I think, it's important to leave you with an area of a couple of important differences. Of course, if it's a Trump administration, we will see extensive rollbacks of environmental standards, a lot less focus on environmental reviews, reducing restrictions. Across the board, though, I think that the dynamics of selling, some of the finished products, both at home and abroad, will be subject to sort of state level regulation there. Critical minerals and mining, if anything, have been less of a public focus of the Trump campaign than the Harris campaign. I think some of that is that some of the advisors were sort of more focused on other parts of the commodities mix. I'm sure that will be rectified, but it strikes me that if anything, the security concerns, the Department of Defense consistent sort of policy is going to be an important driver of policy. We could see, I expect, both less focus on friendshoring, but also new friends. A Trump administration would be less focused on the human rights questions in partner countries, unless human rights and environmental records in those countries could be used in a way to support U.S. Economic interests. The big issue and big elephant in the room is the question on trade policy and tariffs, right? Partly because trade and tariffs are being used as a negotiating, tool, and also because every time former President Trump speaks, he has a different number on what the tariffs could be. For this industry and others, one of the key question marks here is what impact that might have on imported products and items in the supply chain, whether that could lead to the cost of those going up, broad tariffs, and a widening fiscal gap, which is likely as there's both tax cuts and high use of tariffs, could lead to strengthening the US dollar, could lead to persistently higher interest rates. All of these factors might offset some of the other benefits to the sector. Now, it's important to mention that a Harris government would use tariffs too, right? Even though she's underemphasizing that on the campaign trail. I would expect Harris to couple tariffs with the sectors where government money is at stake, right? That's a continuity with the Biden administration, and those sectors are probably going to expand, right? There's a whole new series of areas of America forward, and sort of advanced manufacturing, and those are areas where I think we could see additional tariffs in that way. A Trump administration would court foreign investment, maybe in smaller, sort of in some of the manufacturing. There are sort of questions how that will fit with the national security focus, but I could see trying to partner with sovereign funds in the Gulf, both to invest in the US, but also to invest abroad in supply chains critical to the US. And the other big question mark is, as the size of the federal government and regulator shrinks, whether that will, in the short term at least, maybe slow down some regulatory processes and could lead to some changes and knowledge and progress going forward. But another argument why, if anything, the defense and security focused, contracts likely remain in place. I think I've already talked a fair amount about what a Harris government would do. While there'd be support for critical minerals, especially any that are linked to the energy transition, that, a lot of focus on environmental labor standards, unionized workers, other sort of dynamics. And, we're already seeing challenges in some of the US industrial policy of finding the workers who are needed. And that's something we're seeing on the chip side and otherwise. That may also be that's something that U.S. partners also find of concern. Producers will be under pressure to reduce emissions. There will be more focus on trying to create a common group with European and Western countries on common emission standards. I don't think it'll go that far, but we are entering into a period where Europe's CBAM will come into effect. That also has implications for some of the emerging market producers I was talking about before. And overall, yes, more of a focus on human rights and the type of partners and the like. And there may be, as there's more of a focus on restricting China's access to key technologies, as I say, even more retaliation. Overall, I think this is an environment where there's a greater understanding of the importance of these supply chains from the US and partner governments, but the political timelines and the mining timelines face challenges. And so I think there'll be some opportunities here, but this question mark, especially on trade policy and the dynamics around monetary and fiscal policy, could lead to more market volatility and the like. To give folks a question, I guess I would only and with the following conclusion that where the U.S. is concerned, that projects focused on developing supply chains in the United States likely continue to be attractive given this policy process, and that some of the partner countries that that we've seen challenges aligning either environmental policy or trade policy with, such as even the European Union, or even more so certain emerging market economies, may have to sort of adjust to sort of new rules and new expectations. The next U.S. administration is going to have to grapple with the fact that in a place like Indonesia, that they hope to have a narrow trade agreement to develop critical minerals and other dynamics, that China is such a key player there. I'm not saying that the U.S. has missed the boat. The Indonesians still want U.S. investment, but coming up with these trade structures at a time when the U.S. has many different goals for trade policy, I think creates some challenges. But that means that there can still be sort of opportunities in this space, particularly at the sort of the mining side, as the pendulum shifts a little bit more back to the mining and processing, and away from just the sort of final end users. So thank you very much for your time, and look forward to talking about this more.